You might notice, sometimes in the quiet moments of your day, that your mind plays gentle tricks on you. Small games of perception and thought that unfold so naturally you barely recognize them happening at all. In this video, we'll explore together 20 of these subtle psychological patterns. The soft mechanisms that shape how you think, feel, and move through your world. Phenomena that researchers have observed with care and curiosity, and that continue to influence you even now in this very moment. Subscribe to continue this journey of understanding, and allow yourself to settle into these insights one gentle breath at a time. Let's begin. The Zeigarnik Effect. There is something curious, perhaps, in the way unfinished things occupy the mind. You might notice this yourself, how a task left incomplete seems to whisper at the edges of your thoughts, returning again and again, soft and persistent, like a melody that hasn't quite reached its final note. The psychologist Bluma Zeigarnik observed this phenomenon in the 1920s, noticing something beautiful and strange. Waiters in a Vienna cafe could remember complex, unpaid orders with remarkable clarity, their minds holding each detail with care and attention. But once the bill was settled, once the task completed, those same details dissolved like morning mist, leaving barely a trace in memory. She understood, through patient observation, that the human mind holds onto the incomplete, gives it a special kind of attention, a gentle but persistent energy, as though some part of us cannot fully rest until the circle closes, until the story finds its ending. For example, imagine you're reading a book that captures you deeply, and you must stop mid-chapter to attend to something else. Throughout the day, that unfinished narrative drifts through your awareness, the characters suspended in their moment of tension, waiting for you to return. And you find yourself thinking about it during quiet pauses, your mind reaching back toward that incomplete experience, wanting, in its gentle way, to know what comes next. This same pattern unfolds in countless moments: the email you drafted but haven't sent, the conversation that ended before you could say what you meant, the project that sits, waiting, just short of completion, each one maintaining a soft presence in your mental landscape, each one drawing a small but steady stream of your attention. And this reminds us of something essential about how we're made, that we are, by nature, oriented toward completion, toward wholeness, that the unfinished calls to us not as torment, but as invitation, a gentle nudge from the mind saying, there is something here that still needs your care. The mere exposure effect. Connected to this understanding is another insight, quieter still, about the way familiarity settles into preference, almost without your noticing. The psychologist Robert Zajonc discovered something remarkable in his research: that simple, repeated exposure to something, a face, a word, a melody, a shape, gradually, almost imperceptibly, shifts your feeling toward it, creating a soft warmth, a gentle preference that emerges not from any particular reason or logic, but simply from the quiet fact of recognition itself. He conducted studies where people were shown unfamiliar images, strange symbols, faces they'd never seen. Some images appeared many times, others just once or twice. And later, when asked which they preferred, people consistently chose the ones they'd encountered most often, even when they couldn't consciously remember having seen them before. The preference arose not from beauty or meaning, but from something more fundamental: the comfort of the familiar, the gentle ease that comes when the mind recognizes a pattern it has traced before. You can observe this in your own experience. If you pay attention, a song you found strange or jarring on first listening gradually becomes pleasant with each encounter. A neighbor's face you barely noticed becomes, over time, someone you're genuinely glad to see. Even a route you drive regularly begins to feel more comfortable, more preferable than equally efficient alternatives. This tendency lives deep in your psychology, serving you in ways both helpful and limiting. It helps you form bonds with those around you, simply through the steady accumulation of shared presence. It creates comfort in routine, a sense of home in the places and patterns you return to again and again. But it can also, gently and without your awareness, narrow your world, leading you to prefer what you know simply because you know it, to choose the familiar over the unfamiliar, not because it serves you better, but because it asks less of your mind, because recognition itself carries its own quiet reward. And in this, we find something tender about being human, that we are creatures who find safety in repetition, who learn to love what we return to, that the mind, in its wisdom, makes the regular world feel like home. This understanding leads us, gently, to consider how our preferences form, not always through careful evaluation or deep consideration, but often through the simple, persistent presence of things in our awareness. Through the soft accumulation of moments of exposure that shape, gradually and quietly, what we move toward and what we move away from. The Pratfall Effect. There is a gentle paradox in the way imperfection sometimes draws us closer to others, rather than pushing us away. You might expect, perhaps, that flawlessness would make someone more appealing, that the person who never stumbles, never falters, never reveals a crack in their polished surface would be the one you'd most want to know. And yet, something different unfolds in the actual experience of connection. The psychologist Elliot Aronson explored this beautiful contradiction in the 1960s, conducting studies that revealed something unexpected about human warmth and attraction. He had participants listen to recordings of people answering quiz questions, some performing brilliantly, demonstrating impressive knowledge and capability, others performing more modestly, showing average understanding. But here is where the study became interesting. At the end of some recordings, there was a small, clumsy moment. The sound of a coffee cup being knocked over, a minor spill, a very human accident, nothing significant, just a brief glimpse of imperfection. And when participants rated how much they liked each person, something surprising emerged. The highly competent person who spilled the coffee became more likable, not less. The small mistake didn't diminish their appeal. Instead, it softened them, made them more approachable, more real, more human in a way that actually increased warmth and connection. For those who had performed only modestly, the spilled coffee didn't have the same effect. But for the capable, accomplished person, that moment of clumsiness became, paradoxically, a gift. A small opening through which others could feel closer, more at ease, less intimidated by excellence. For example, imagine you're in a meeting with someone who seems remarkably accomplished. They speak with confidence, their ideas are sharp and well-formed, and you find yourself feeling slightly small in their presence, slightly uncertain of your own contributions. And then, mid-sentence, they lose their train of thought completely, laugh at themselves, admit they've forgotten what they were saying, and in that moment, something shifts. You breathe a little easier. You feel, perhaps, that you can be yourself more fully around them, that their competence doesn't require your diminishment. This pattern appears throughout your relationships, if you look gently for it. The friend whose vulnerability makes you love them more, not less. The teacher whose occasional confusion makes the classroom feel safer. The leader whose honest admission of uncertainty creates trust rather than eroding it. There is something deeply relieving in this understanding, that your own small stumbles and imperfections might not be the obstacles you imagine them to be, that they might, in fact, be the very things that allow others to move closer to you, to see you as someone real and reachable rather than distant and intimidating. And this reminds us that connection often lives in the spaces where our polished surfaces crack just slightly, where we reveal ourselves as beautifully, ordinarily human, where others can recognize themselves in our experience and feel, in that recognition, less alone. The Ben Franklin Effect. Building softly on this foundation of unexpected human warmth, there is another pattern worth considering, one that reveals something curious about how favors shape the landscape of our feelings. You might assume that when you do something kind for someone, you come to like them more, that the act of giving creates positive feeling toward the recipient, and this is often true in its way. But something else unfolds as well, something less obvious and more surprising. Benjamin Franklin, that careful observer of human nature, noticed something peculiar in his own experience. He found that when he asked someone who disliked him for a small favor, lending him a rare book, for instance, and that person agreed, something shifted between them. The person who had been cool toward him became warmer, more friendly, not because Franklin had done something for them, but because they had done something for him. Later research would confirm what Franklin observed through his lived experience, that when we do a favor for someone, we tend to like them more afterward. Our minds, seeking consistency and harmony, work to align our feelings with our actions, and we find ourselves thinking, perhaps without words, I helped this person, therefore they must be someone worth helping, someone I regard with some warmth and care. This gentle shift happens beneath the surface of conscious thought. You do someone a kindness, and your mind quietly adjusts your perception of them to match your behavior, creating a soft coherence between what you've done and how you feel. For example, imagine a colleague you felt neutral about, perhaps even slightly annoyed by, and one day they ask you for help with something, nothing large, just some information you have or a small task you can easily do. You agree, you help them, and something subtle changes. Over the following days, you notice you're a bit friendlier toward them. You smile more easily when you see them. You think of them with slightly more generosity, not because they've done anything different, but because you helped them, and in helping, you began to see them as someone worthy of your help. This understanding opens up interesting possibilities in your relationships. When you want to warm someone toward you, you might ask them for a small favor rather than offering one, inviting them to invest something of themselves, which their mind will then justify by creating positive feeling toward you. And there is something beautifully human in this pattern, the way our actions shape our feelings rather than always flowing from them, the way we become kinder by acting kindly even when the feeling doesn't come first, the way doing good creates a gentle momentum toward feeling good about the person we've helped. This helps us understand that our emotions are not fixed, separate things that dictate our behavior from some distant throne. They are woven into our actions, shaped by them, emerging from them in a constant, flowing exchange. The spotlight effect. There is a way, sometimes, that you move through the world feeling as though a gentle light follows you, as though others notice and remember your small mistakes, your awkward moments, your imperfections, as though you are, somehow, more visible than you actually are. The psychologists Thomas Gilovich and Kenneth Savitsky gave a name to this phenomenon, this feeling of being watched more closely than you truly are, calling it the spotlight effect, after that sense of standing illuminated on a stage while others observe from the darkness. They conducted a series of studies that revealed something both comforting and humbling. We consistently overestimate how much others notice about us, how much attention they pay to our appearance, our behavior, our moments of embarrassment or uncertainty. In one gentle experiment, they had a student wear a t-shirt featuring a prominently displayed image, something they'd feel self-conscious about, and then enter a room where other students were working. Later, when asked how many people in the room would remember the shirt, the wearer estimated far more than actually did. The spotlight felt bright and obvious from the inside, but from the outside, it barely registered. This pattern unfolds constantly in your daily experience if you pause to notice it. You say something in a meeting that sounds wrong the moment it leaves your mouth, and you imagine everyone will remember and judge you for it. But by the next day, or even the next hour, it has dissolved from their awareness completely. They were attending to their own thoughts, their own concerns, their own internal spotlight. For example, imagine you're walking through a crowded space and you stumble slightly, catching yourself before you fall. In that moment, you might feel a flush of embarrassment, certain that dozens of eyes witnessed your clumsiness, certain that people are forming judgments, sharing glances, remembering this moment. But if you could somehow access their actual experience, you'd find that most didn't notice at all, and those who did have already moved on, their attention claimed by the steady stream of their own thoughts and perceptions. This understanding offers something valuable, a gentle loosening of the self-consciousness that can make the world feel like an examining room. You can move through your days with slightly more ease, knowing that the spotlight you feel is largely of your own making, that others are mostly attending to themselves, to their own internal experience, just as you attend primarily to yours. And yet there is also something tender in this realization, a soft loneliness in understanding how little we actually occupy each other's awareness, how much of our experience unfolds unwitnessed, unremarked upon, noticed mainly by ourselves. We exist, each of us, in our own small circle of attention, concerned with our own stumbles and victories, our own appearance and performance, while others exist in theirs, and these circles overlap far less than we imagine. This reminds us to hold our embarrassments lightly, to know that the moments we replay with cringing regret have likely long faded from others' memory, and also, perhaps, to pay more attention when we wish to truly see someone, to step beyond our own preoccupations and offer the gift of genuine noticing. The halo effect. Connected to this understanding of perception is another layer worth exploring. The way a single quality can cast its light across everything else we notice about a person, coloring our entire impression with its particular glow. The psychologist Edward Thorndike first documented this phenomenon almost a century ago, observing something both predictable and troubling in how we form judgments about others when we perceive someone as having one positive quality. Physical attractiveness, perhaps, or confidence or warmth. We tend, without conscious intention, to assume they possess other positive qualities as well. The attractive person becomes, in our perception, also intelligent, kind, competent, not because we have evidence of these traits, but because the mind seeks consistency, wants the story to be coherent, wants beautiful to mean good in all the ways we understand goodness. This halo of positive assumption extends outward from that single perceived quality, touching and transforming everything else we notice, creating a gentle distortion in our perception, a soft bias that shapes our judgments before we've gathered much actual information. And the reverse is equally true. One perceived negative quality can cast a shadow across our entire impression. The person who seems cold or awkward in first meeting may be unconsciously judged as less intelligent, less trustworthy, less capable, even when we have no real basis for these conclusions. For example, imagine meeting someone at a gathering who is exceptionally well-spoken, articulate, and eloquent in a way that captures your attention. You might find yourself assuming, without quite realizing it, that they're also well-educated, professionally successful, probably good at many things. Your mind takes that one observed quality and builds an entire story around it, filling in details you don't actually know with assumptions that feel true because they fit the pattern. Or perhaps you encounter someone who is physically attractive by conventional standards, and you notice yourself attributing to them qualities you haven't observed, assuming they're friendly or interesting or worthy of trust, simply because your mind wants their inner qualities to match their outer presentation. This tendency operates quietly beneath your conscious awareness, influencing decisions large and small. Whom you hire, whom you befriend, whom you trust with responsibility, whom you dismiss before truly knowing. The halo casts its light or its shadow, and you respond to that coloring as though it were objective truth. Understanding this pattern invites something important, a gentle skepticism toward your own first impressions, a willingness to separate the qualities you actually observe from the ones you're merely assuming, to notice when you're building a complete story from insufficient evidence. And this helps us see that our perceptions of others are always, to some degree, creative acts. Stories we tell ourselves based on fragments of information, interpretations shaped by these subtle cognitive patterns that operate whether we acknowledge them or not. The challenge, then, is not to eliminate these tendencies. They run too deep in how the mind naturally works, but to hold them lightly, to know that the glow you perceive around someone or the shadow might say as much about how you're looking as about what you're actually seeing. The anchoring effect. There is something curious about the way the first piece of information you encounter, the first number, the first impression, the first suggestion, settles into your mind like a stone dropped into still water, creating ripples that influence everything that follows. Psychologists Amos Tversky and Daniel Kahneman explored this phenomenon with careful attention, discovering that even arbitrary, meaningless numbers can serve as anchors, invisible reference points that pull your subsequent judgments toward them, even when you know, consciously, that they have no bearing on what you're trying to decide. In one of their elegant studies, they had participants spin a wheel that landed on a random number, and then asked them to estimate what percentage of African nations were members of the United Nations. The random number from the wheel, completely unrelated to the question, nevertheless influenced their answers. Those who saw a higher number gave higher estimates, those who saw a lower number gave lower estimates. The arbitrary anchor had quietly shaped their thinking. This same pattern appears throughout your daily life, in ways both subtle and significant. When you see a product originally priced at one amount, then marked down to another, the original price becomes an anchor, shaping your perception of value, making the sale price seem more attractive than it might if you'd encountered it without that reference point. The first salary number mentioned in a negotiation sets an anchor that influences the entire conversation. The first bid on a house, the first suggestion of where to meet for dinner, the first opinion voiced in a group discussion, each becomes a gravitational center that subtly pulls subsequent thoughts and offers toward it. For example, imagine you're shopping for a lamp and you have no particular idea what a lamp should cost. You see one marked at $200, then another marked at $75. That second lamp seems quite reasonable, perhaps even inexpensive. But if you had encountered the $75 lamp first, without the $200 anchor, your feeling about its price might be entirely different. The anchor shapes your sense of what is normal, what is expected, what represents good value. Or perhaps you're estimating how long a project will take, and someone casually mentions it might take 3 weeks. That number settles into your mind as a reference point, and your own estimate will likely hover somewhere in that range, even if you have different information or experience. The anchor has done its quiet work. Understanding this tendency offers you something useful, an awareness that your judgments are not formed in a vacuum, but are shaped by whatever reference points arrived first. This awareness allows you to pause, to notice what anchors might be operating in your thinking, to ask yourself whether the first number or impression you encountered is truly relevant, or whether it's simply pulling your thoughts toward it through this subtle cognitive gravity. And this reminds us that our minds are not the perfectly objective instruments we sometimes imagine them to be. They are influenced by order and context, by what comes first and what comes framed in particular ways. Understanding this doesn't eliminate the influence, but it does create a small space for questioning, for noticing when you might be drifting toward an anchor that doesn't serve your actual judgment. Confirmation bias. Building on this understanding of how information shapes our thinking, there is another pattern to consider, one that reveals something both understandable and limiting about how you seek and interpret information. You might imagine that when you hold a belief or form an opinion, you would naturally seek out diverse perspectives, looking for information that challenges your view as readily as information that supports it, testing your understanding against competing evidence with equal openness to all possibilities. But the psychologist Peter Wasson, among many others, discovered something different in how the mind actually operates. We tend, quite naturally and without malice, to seek information that confirms what we already believe, to notice and remember evidence that supports our existing views, and to overlook, dismiss, or forget information that contradicts them. This tendency isn't a character flaw or a sign of close-mindedness. It's simply how the mind works when left to its natural inclinations. It feels good to be right, to have your perceptions validated. It feels coherent and safe, and it feels uncomfortable, even threatening, to encounter information that suggests you might be wrong about something you've already decided. So you selectively attend, noticing the news stories that align with your political views, remembering the anecdotes that support your opinion about a person or situation, interpreting ambiguous evidence in the way that fits most comfortably with what you already think. For example, imagine you've formed the belief that a particular colleague is unreliable. Once that belief settles in, you'll tend to notice every time they're late to a meeting, every deadline they miss, every small way they fall short. These instances confirm your view, and your mind holds onto them as evidence. Meanwhile, the times they follow through perfectly, the moments of reliability and competence, tend to fade from your attention, not because you're deliberately ignoring them, but because they don't fit the pattern you've already established. They create cognitive dissonance rather than comfortable confirmation. Or perhaps you believe you're not good at a particular skill, mathematics, perhaps, or social situations, and you notice every mistake, every stumble, every moment that confirms this belief about yourself. While your successes get explained away as luck or accident, not really counting as evidence that your belief might be incomplete. This tendency creates a kind of self-reinforcing loop. Your beliefs shape what you notice, and what you notice strengthens your beliefs, making it quite difficult to change your mind even when substantial contradicting evidence exists, because you're simply not attending to that evidence with the same openness and weight. Understanding confirmation bias invites something important, a gentle humility about your own certainty, a willingness to actively seek perspectives that challenge what you think you know, to deliberately look for disconfirming evidence rather than waiting for it to force itself upon your attention. This doesn't mean abandoning your beliefs at the first sign of contradiction, but it does mean holding them a bit more lightly, knowing that the evidence you've gathered might be filtered through this natural tendency to see what confirms rather than what challenges. And this reminds us that truth-seeking requires effort that runs counter to our natural inclinations, that the mind left to itself will create coherent stories that feel true but might be built on selectively gathered evidence. That wisdom involves questioning not just others' views, but the way you've arrived at your own. The Dunning-Kruger Effect. There is a gentle irony in the relationship between what you know and what you think you know, a pattern that reveals something both humbling and compassionate about how understanding actually develops. The psychologists David Dunning and Justin Kruger noticed something unexpected when they studied how people assess their own competence in various domains. Those with the least skill or knowledge in a particular area often felt the most confident in their abilities, while those with genuine expertise tended to be more uncertain, more aware of the vastness of what they didn't yet understand. This isn't arrogance or foolishness on the part of beginners. It's something more interesting and more forgivable. When you know very little about a subject, you also don't know enough to recognize what you're missing. You lack the very knowledge needed to assess your own lack of knowledge. The landscape appears simple because you cannot yet see its complexity. As you begin to learn, your confidence might actually decrease for a time, not because you're becoming less competent, but because you're becoming aware of how much more there is to know. The mountain seemed small from the base, but as you climb, you begin to see the vastness of the range stretching beyond. Eventually, with sustained learning and practice, your competence grows until it surpasses your uncertainty. But even then, true experts often maintain a quality of humility. They've seen enough to know how intricate their field truly is, how much remains unknown, how easy it is to be wrong even when you feel certain. For example, imagine someone who has just learned the basic rules of chess. They might feel quite confident in their understanding of the game, might even offer advice to others, or feel ready to compete seriously. They know the pieces move in certain ways, they understand the objective, and this feels like substantial knowledge. but they cannot yet see the layers of strategy, the countless opening variations, the deep positional understanding that separates beginners from masters. Their confidence comes partly from not knowing what they don't know. Or perhaps you've experienced this yourself when learning something new. In the early stages, it seemed straightforward, manageable. You felt you were grasping it well. But as you continued, you began to realize how much complexity you'd initially missed, how your early confidence was based on a simplified understanding, and you entered a phase where you felt less certain, more aware of your limitations, even as you were actually becoming more skilled. This pattern invites something valuable, a gentleness with yourself when you're learning, an acceptance that the journey involves phases of misplaced confidence followed by appropriate uncertainty. And it invites patience with others who seem overconfident in areas where they're actually beginners, understanding that this confidence isn't usually arrogance, but rather a natural stage in the learning process. It also suggests the wisdom of seeking multiple perspectives, especially from those who might appear less certain. Their uncertainty might signal depth of understanding rather than lack of it, while someone's supreme confidence might indicate they're still in the early stages of knowing. And this reminds us that true expertise often wears the clothing of humility, that the more you genuinely understand something, the more you see its complexity, its nuances, its exceptions and uncertainties, and that confident simplicity, while appealing and comfortable, often signals the early stages of understanding rather than its culmination. The availability heuristic. Connected to these patterns of judgment and assessment is another tendency worth exploring gently: the way your mind uses the ease with which something comes to mind as a measure of its frequency or importance. Tversky and Kahneman, those careful observers of cognitive patterns, identified this heuristic, this mental shortcut, noting that when examples of something spring easily to your awareness, you tend to judge that thing as more common, more likely, more significant than things that require more effort to recall. This makes a certain practical sense. In many cases, things that happen frequently are easier to remember simply because you've encountered them more often. The common does tend to be more available to memory than the rare. But the relationship isn't always reliable. Sometimes things are easy to recall not because they're common, but because they're vivid, emotional, recent, or heavily covered by media. And your mind, using ease of recall as its measuring stick, misjudges their actual frequency. For example, many people fear airplane crashes more than car accidents, even though you are vastly more likely to be harmed in a car. But airplane crashes, when they occur, are dramatic, widely reported, seared into collective memory. They come to mind easily, vividly, and that ease of recall makes them feel more probable than they actually are. Meanwhile, car accidents, though far more common, feel less threatening because each individual incident receives less attention, creates less memorable impact. Or perhaps you notice this in your personal life. You might believe that a particular friend cancels plans frequently, is unreliable, and when you try to remember, several instances come readily to mind. The memory of waiting for them, of feeling disappointed, arrives easily. But if you were to actually count, you might discover they've only cancelled twice out of 20 meetings. The emotional weight of those cancellations made them more available to memory, and that availability created a distorted sense of their frequency. Recent events also carry this quality of enhanced availability. Something that happened yesterday feels more significant, more representative, more worthy of attention than something that happened months ago, even if the older event was actually more important. The nearness in time makes it easier to recall, and ease of recall influences your judgment of its significance. Understanding this heuristic helps you notice when your sense of frequency or probability might be distorted by what's most easily recalled rather than what's most actually true. It invites you to pause and ask, is this really common, or is it just vivid and memorable? Am I judging probability based on actual data, or based on what springs most readily to mind. This awareness doesn't eliminate the heuristic. Your mind will continue to use ease of recall as one of its tools for quick judgment, but it creates a small opening for correction, for seeking actual frequencies when decisions matter, for recognizing that your gut feeling about how common something is might be shaped more by memorability than by reality. And this reminds us that the mind, for all its sophistication, relies on shortcuts that work well enough most of the time, but can lead us gently astray. That our sense of what's probable and what's rare is constructed partly from actual experience and partly from these subtle distortions of memory and attention. The peak-end rule. There is a curious way that memory simplifies experience, reducing the flow of lived moments into something more manageable, more story-like. And in that simplification, certain moments receive more weight than others. The psychologist Daniel Kahneman discovered through patient research that when you remember an experience, a vacation, a medical procedure, a relationship, an event, your memory doesn't average all the moments together with equal weight. Instead, it focuses particularly on two specific points: the peak, whether pleasant or unpleasant, and the end, how the experience concluded. These two moments, the most intense and the final, come to represent the entire experience in your memory, often more than the actual duration or the majority of moments that fell somewhere in between. He demonstrated this in a study that seems almost cruel in its cleverness. Participants underwent an uncomfortable procedure of holding their hand in painfully cold water. Some experienced this for 60 seconds, then were allowed to remove their hand. Others experienced the same 60 seconds, but then had to keep their hand in slightly less cold, though still uncomfortable, water for an additional 30 seconds before being allowed to stop. When asked later which experience they'd prefer to repeat, most chose the longer one, even though it contained all the pain of the shorter experience plus additional discomfort. Because it ended more gently, on a less intense note, the memory of the entire experience was more favorable. The end had reshaped how they remembered the whole. This same pattern unfolds in countless aspects of your life, if you pause to notice it. A vacation might contain many ordinary moments, some frustrations, some delays, but if the peak experience was truly wonderful, a breathtaking view, a perfect meal, a moment of deep connection, and if it ended well with a smooth journey home and a satisfying final day, you remember the entire vacation fondly, perhaps more fondly than a moment-by-moment accounting would justify. For example, imagine a long dinner party that stretches over several hours. The beginning is pleasant enough, the middle contains some awkward lulls and some genuine enjoyment, nothing remarkable in either direction. But then there's a moment of particularly wonderful conversation, genuine laughter, a feeling of real belonging, the peak of the evening. And it ends with warm goodbyes, sincere hugs, a sense of completion. When you think back on that dinner party days or weeks later, you remember it as a lovely evening. The peak and the end have colored your memory of the whole, while the more mundane middle portions fade into gentle background. Or perhaps you notice this in relationships. A friendship that contained many good years but ended badly might be remembered with more bitterness than those good years would seem to warrant. The ending reshapes the story in memory, while a difficult relationship that found genuine closure and peace might be remembered more kindly than the accumulated struggles would predict. Understanding this pattern offers something practical. It suggests that how things end matters profoundly to how they're remembered, that creating positive endings, even to difficult experiences, can shift how those experiences live in memory. And it reminds you that your memories of past experiences might be shaped more by these intense and final moments than by the actual texture of the whole. This doesn't make your memories false, exactly, but it does reveal them as constructed, shaped by these patterns of emphasis and selection, and it invites you to hold them gently, knowing they tell a particular kind of truth, but perhaps not the only truth available. And this reminds us that we are, in some sense, always living in two timeframes at once. The experiencing self, who lives through each moment as it unfolds, and the remembering self, who will later construct a story from peaks and endings. These two selves don't always want the same things, don't always value experiences in the same way. The serial position effect. Connected to this understanding of memory's selectivity is another pattern equally revealing. The way position in a sequence influences what you remember and what fades away. The psychologist Hermann Ebbinghaus, working in the late 1800s with meticulous attention to detail, discovered something interesting about how we recall lists of information. Items at the beginning and items at the end are remembered more readily than items in the middle, as though memory has stronger anchors at the boundaries of experience and softer ground in between. This phenomenon divides into two related effects: the primacy effect, where items encountered first receive special attention and encoding into long-term memory, and the recency effect, where items encountered last remain fresh in short-term memory, easily accessible for a brief time after learning. But items in the middle, those suffer from both directions. They're no longer fresh enough for short-term memory, yet they didn't receive the focused attention that early items commanded when your mind was still alert and uncluttered by previous information. You can observe this in everyday experience. When you meet several new people in quick succession, you're most likely to remember the names of the first person and the last person you met, while those introduced in the middle blur together, their names slipping away despite your good intentions to remember. For example, imagine attending a presentation where someone lists 10 important points. If you're like most people, you'll remember the first couple of points fairly well. They had your full attention, you were still fresh and focused. And you'll remember the final point or two, partly because they're most recent, partly because you knew the ending was approaching and paid closer attention. But points 4 through 7, those have a tendency to disappear into a kind of foggy middle ground, harder to distinguish, harder to recall. Or perhaps you notice this when reading. The beginning of an article captures your attention with particular clarity, you process it carefully. The ending also stands out, especially if it contains a clear conclusion or call to action. But the middle paragraphs, even if they contain important information, don't always anchor themselves in memory with the same firmness. Understanding this effect has practical applications. When you have something important to communicate, positioning matters. Leading with it takes advantage of primacy. Ending with it takes advantage of recency. Burying it in the middle almost ensures it will be forgotten by many who hear it. And when you're trying to learn or remember information, this awareness invites you to pay deliberate attention to the middle portions, to recognize that your mind's natural tendency is to let them slip away, and to counter that tendency with extra focus, perhaps breaking long sequences into shorter ones so that there are more beginnings and endings, fewer middles. This reminds us that memory is not a simple recording device that captures everything with equal fidelity. It has preferences, tendencies, patterns of emphasis, and understanding these patterns helps you work with your memory rather than against it, helps you design experiences and learning in ways that acknowledge how the mind actually operates rather than how we might wish it operated. The Google Effect. There is something quietly significant happening to memory in this age of instant information, a shift in not just what you remember, but in what you feel you need to remember at all. The psychologist Betsy Sparrow, along with her colleagues, explored this phenomenon with careful curiosity, noticing that when people know information will be available externally, saved in a computer, searchable online, stored in a digital device, they remember the information itself less well, but they remember quite clearly where to find it. The mind, it seems, adapts to its tools. When memory can be externalized, stored outside the boundaries of your own awareness, something shifts in how you process and retain information. You become less of a container for facts and more of a directory, knowing not the information itself, but the path to reach it when needed. This isn't necessarily loss, though it can feel that way. It's more a kind of transformation, a redistribution of what the mind holds and what it delegates to external storage. In Sparrow's studies, participants who believed information would be saved on a computer showed less recall of that information later, not because they weren't paying attention, but because their minds, recognizing that the information was secured elsewhere, didn't encode it as deeply, didn't give it the kind of processing that transfers facts into longer-term memory. Meanwhile, they were quite good at remembering where the information was saved, which folder, which file. The mind still worked to remember, but it remembered location rather than content, a meta-memory, you might call it, knowing where knowing lives. For example, you might notice this in your own experience with phone numbers. There was perhaps a time when you held many numbers in your memory, could recite them easily when needed. But now, with every number saved in your phone, readily accessible with a few taps, how many can you actually recall? The information hasn't disappeared from the world, but it has moved from internal to external storage. And your mind, recognizing this shift, has allowed those numbers to fade from active memory. Or perhaps you experience this when reading online. You encounter interesting information, and rather than working to commit it to memory, you bookmark it, save it, trust that you can return to it when needed. And often you can. But sometimes you find you've saved so much that you can no longer quite remember what you saved or where. The external storage system has become cluttered, and the information you intended to preserve has become, in a different way, lost. This pattern raises gentle questions about what is gained and what might be lost in this exchange. You have access to vastly more information than any previous generation, the collective knowledge of humanity available through a few keystrokes. And yet, perhaps, you hold less of it personally, have less of it woven into the fabric of your own understanding. There's something different about knowledge you carry within you, accessible even in silence, even in solitude, even without devices. Knowledge that becomes part of how you think rather than something you periodically look up. It integrates differently, connects to other things you know in ways that externally stored information might not. And yet, the mind's adaptation is also efficient in its way. Why burden yourself with information that's reliably available elsewhere? Why not free that cognitive space for other forms of processing, for creativity, for connection, for presence in the moment? This reminds us that every tool that extends human capability also shapes it, changes not just what we can do, but how we do it, what we attend to, what we practice and strengthen. Understanding this doesn't require rejecting the tools, but it does invite awareness of how they're quietly reshaping the landscape of your mind. Rosy Retrospection. Building gently from this exploration of memory, there is another pattern worth considering. The way time itself seems to soften the edges of experience, tinting the past with warmer tones than it wore when it was still the present. You might notice, if you reflect on your own memory, that the past often appears more pleasant in recollection than it felt while you were living it. The difficulties fade or diminish in memory, while the good moments hold their color, perhaps even intensify, creating a version of the past that's kinder, gentler, more golden than the lived reality. Psychologists have documented this tendency across many contexts. People remember vacations as more enjoyable than they rated them day by day while they were happening. They remember past relationships more fondly after time has passed. They look back on previous periods of their lives, college, childhood, earlier careers, with a nostalgic warmth that overlooks or minimizes the struggles and uncertainties that characterized those times when they were actually unfolding. This isn't dishonesty or delusion. It's simply how memory works over time. The emotional sting of negative experiences tends to fade faster than the warm glow of positive ones, leaving behind a past that feels, in aggregate, better than the present often feels while you're in it. For example, imagine looking back on your school years. You might remember them with genuine fondness, the friendships, the freedom, the simplicity of those times, conveniently forgetting the social anxieties, the academic pressures, the confusions and insecurities that were actually quite present in your daily experience then. Time has filtered the memory, keeping what's pleasant and letting the rest recede into soft background. Or perhaps you notice this with former jobs or living situations. Places you were eager to leave at the time might appear in memory as having had certain charms, certain qualities you miss. Now that you're no longer dealing with the daily frustrations, those frustrations have faded while the good aspects, perhaps the shorter commute, or the friendly colleague, or the familiar routine, glow more brightly in recollection. This tendency serves you in some ways. It allows you to move forward without being weighed down by accumulated bitterness. It creates a sense that life has been, overall, good, that you've had positive experiences worth cherishing, and it contributes to feelings of gratitude and contentment when you reflect on your personal history. But it can also create a subtle trap, a sense that the past was better than the present, that things used to be easier or more pleasant or more meaningful than they are now. This can make you somewhat dissatisfied with current life, always feeling that something has been lost, that you're moving away from some golden period rather than toward possibility. And it can distort your decision-making. You might return to situations that you remember fondly, but that were actually quite difficult. Relationships, places, patterns, expecting to recapture the rosy version in memory, only to rediscover the problems that your memory had kindly filtered out. Understanding this effect invites a gentle balance, appreciating that your positive memories are real, that those good moments did happen and are worth treasuring, while also recognizing that the past wasn't quite as uniformly wonderful as memory suggests, and that the present, which might feel more difficult or complicated, will likely also be remembered more kindly than it feels right now. This reminds us that we live simultaneously with multiple versions of our experience, the raw, unfiltered present with all its complexity, and the softened, edited past that memory constructs, and both are true in their way, serving different purposes in how we understand ourselves and our lives. The paradox of choice. There is a gentle irony in the relationship between freedom and satisfaction, a pattern that suggests more options don't always lead to greater contentment and might, in fact, create their own particular burden. The psychologist Barry Schwartz devoted considerable attention to this phenomenon, observing something unexpected about how abundance affects well-being. When you have too many choices, the decision-making process itself can become overwhelming, even paralyzing, and the choice you eventually make, rather than feeling satisfying, can leave you wondering about all the paths not taken. In a world of limited options, choosing is relatively straightforward. You evaluate what's available and select the best option from that constrained set. But when options multiply into dozens or hundreds, when every product comes in countless variations, when every decision branches into infinite possibilities, something shifts in the experience of choosing. The abundance that seems like it should liberate you can instead burden you. Each option represents a potential road, and choosing one means foreclosing all the others. The weight of all those unchosen possibilities can make even good choices feel tinged with regret. Schwartz and his colleagues demonstrated this in a now famous study involving jam. Shoppers encountered a tasting table with either 6 varieties of jam or 24 varieties. The larger selection attracted more initial interest. People stopped more often to look, but when it came to actual purchasing, something interesting emerged. Those who encountered 6 options were far more likely to actually buy jam than those who encountered 24. The abundance had created a kind of paralysis, or at least a hesitation, that prevented decision. For example, you might notice this when trying to choose something to watch from a streaming service offering thousands of options. You scroll and scroll, evaluating possibilities, reading descriptions, unable to settle on any single choice, because each one means not choosing all the others. And often, after spending considerable time and energy on the decision, you feel less satisfied with what you finally select than you might have felt with fewer options and a simpler choice. Or perhaps you've experienced this when shopping for something relatively simple, a pair of shoes, perhaps, or a household item. The sheer number of variations, colors, styles, features, prices, can transform what should be a straightforward purchase into an exhausting process of comparison and evaluation. And even after you decide, you might find yourself wondering if you chose wisely, if some other option might have been better. This pattern creates what Schwartz calls the paradox of choice, the freedom and abundance that modern life offers. Something that appears purely positive carries hidden costs in terms of time, energy, satisfaction, and peace of mind. Understanding this doesn't mean eliminating all choice or preferring restrictions, but it does suggest the value of sometimes deliberately limiting your options, of creating boundaries that make decisions more manageable, of recognizing that the discomfort you feel when faced with abundance isn't a personal failing, but a natural response to cognitive overload. And this reminds us that more is not always better, that the mind has limits to its decision-making capacity, and that sometimes the most liberating thing you can do is narrow the field, constrain the possibilities, and allow yourself to choose from a smaller set with greater peace. Loss aversion. Connected to this understanding of how we make choices is another deep pattern in human psychology, one that reveals an asymmetry in how you experience gains and losses, pleasure and pain. The psychologists Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky discovered through extensive research that losses loom larger than gains in your psychological experience. The pain of losing something feels roughly twice as intense as the pleasure of gaining something of equivalent value. Your mind weighs the negative more heavily than the positive, creating a fundamental imbalance in how you respond to potential outcomes. This isn't irrational exactly. From an evolutionary perspective, it makes sense. Missing an opportunity for gain is unfortunate but survivable, but a significant loss could be catastrophic. So the mind evolved to be especially sensitive to potential losses, to weight them heavily in decision-making, to work hard to avoid them. But in the modern world, this tendency can shape your choices in ways that don't always serve you well. You might avoid reasonable risks because the potential loss feels so weighty, even when the potential gain is objectively larger. You might stay in situations that aren't quite right because leaving would mean losing what you currently have, even if what you might gain is significantly better. For example, imagine you're offered a bet, a coin flip where if you win, you receive $150, but if you lose, you pay $100. Mathematically, this is a good bet. The expected value is positive, but most people would decline it. The thought of losing $100 feels more significant, more real, more painful than the thought of gaining $150 feels pleasant. The potential loss dominates your feeling about the choice, even though the odds favor you. Or perhaps you notice this in your resistance to change. You might stay in a job that's moderately unsatisfying because it's familiar, stable, known. The thought of losing that stability, that reliable paycheck, those established relationships feels more powerful than the abstract possibility of finding something better elsewhere. The loss is concrete and vivid, while the potential gain is uncertain and hazy, and loss aversion keeps you rooted in place. This same pattern appears in how you relate to possessions, to relationships, to identities and habits. Once something is yours, losing it feels more significant than gaining it felt in the first place. The status quo becomes weighted, valuable simply because it's what you currently have, and moving away from it triggers that deep sensitivity to loss. Understanding loss aversion helps you recognize when you might be overweighting potential losses in your decision-making, when the fear of losing is preventing you from pursuing something that could genuinely improve your life. It doesn't eliminate the feeling. That asymmetry between loss and gain runs deep, but it creates awareness, a small space where you can ask yourself whether the loss you're afraid of is truly as significant as it feels in this moment. And this reminds us that we are not perfectly rational calculators of costs and benefits. Our feelings about gains and losses don't match their objective values. The mind has its own logic, its own weights and measures, and understanding this logic allows us to work with it more skillfully, to notice when it's serving us and when it might be holding us back from possibilities worth pursuing. The Bystander Effect. There is something unexpected in the way responsibility diffuses when it is shared among many. A pattern that reveals how the presence of others can paradoxically make us less likely to act rather than more. You might imagine that if someone needed help, they would be more likely to receive it in a crowded place than in an empty one, that more witnesses would mean more potential helpers, greater likelihood that someone would step forward. But research reveals something quite different, something that helps us understand why people sometimes fail to act in situations where help is clearly needed. The psychologists John Darley and Bib Latané became interested in this phenomenon after a tragic incident in which a woman was attacked while numerous people witnessed from their apartments, yet no one intervened or called for help. Rather than simply condemning those witnesses, Darley and Latané sought to understand what psychological processes might explain such seemingly callous inaction. Through careful experimentation, they discovered what came to be called the bystander effect. When multiple people witness an emergency or someone in need, each individual feels less personal responsibility to act. The presence of others creates a diffusion of responsibility, a sense that someone else will surely help, that it doesn't have to be you specifically. And when everyone experiences this same diffusion, the result can be that no one acts at all. In one of their studies, participants were led to believe they were having a discussion with other students over an intercom system. During the discussion, one participant appeared to have a medical emergency, clearly in distress. When participants thought they were the only one who could hear the person in trouble, they responded quickly, seeking help. But when they believed there were other witnesses, their response slowed or didn't come at all. The responsibility felt distributed, less urgent, less specifically theirs to carry. For example, imagine you're walking down a busy street and you notice someone who appears lost or confused, perhaps elderly, perhaps struggling in some way. If you're alone on the street with them, you might feel a clear sense of responsibility. It's just you and them, and if you don't offer help, no one will. But if the street is crowded with dozens of other people, all passing by, you might hesitate, thinking surely someone else is better positioned to help, or has already helped, or will help in a moment. The crowd, paradoxically, makes helping feel less necessary for any particular individual. Or perhaps you've experienced this in group settings. An email goes to an entire team asking for assistance, and you assume someone else will respond. Or everyone assumes this, and the request goes unanswered. The responsibility that would feel clear if directed to you alone becomes foggy and uncertain when distributed across many. Understanding this effect doesn't mean condemning yourself or others for this tendency. It's a natural psychological pattern, not a moral failing. But awareness of it can shift how you respond. When you notice yourself thinking, someone else will handle this, you can recognize that thought as potentially the same thought everyone else is having. And you can choose, despite that thought, to take personal responsibility even when it's distributed among many. This also suggests the value of making responsibility specific rather than diffuse. If you need help, addressing one particular person directly is far more effective than asking a group. The bystander effect loses its power when responsibility is clearly assigned rather than floating ambiguously among many. And this reminds us of something important about human nature. We are deeply social creatures, and our sense of responsibility is influenced by the social context we're in. The presence of others shapes not just our behavior, but our very sense of what's ours to do. Understanding this helps us act more intentionally, more courageously, more in alignment with our values, even when the situation doesn't make that action feel naturally urgent. The fundamental attribution error. Connected to this exploration of how we understand behavior is another pervasive pattern, one that reveals an asymmetry in how you explain your own actions versus how you explain the actions of others. The psychologist Lee Ross named this tendency the fundamental attribution error, observing that when you watch others behave in certain ways, you tend to attribute their behavior to their character, their personality, their internal qualities, while giving relatively little weight to the situational factors that might be influencing them. But when explaining your own behavior, the pattern reverses. You're acutely aware of all the situational pressures, constraints, and contexts that shaped what you did. You see your actions as responses to circumstances, not simply expressions of your fixed character. Someone else is late to a meeting, and you might think they're disorganized or inconsiderate. But when you're late to a meeting, you're aware of the traffic, the last-minute emergency, the series of events beyond your control that led to the delay. You see your lateness as situational, while seeing others' lateness as dispositional. This asymmetry makes sense from your position as the one living inside your own experience. You have access to all the thoughts, pressures, circumstances, and constraints that influence your choices. You know your internal landscape intimately, but you can only observe others from the outside, seeing their actions without full access to the complex web of factors that produced those actions. And so you fill in what you cannot see with assumptions about their character. For example, imagine a colleague snaps at you during a meeting, responding to your question with unexpected irritation. Your first thought might be that they're rude or temperamental or have some negative feeling toward you. You attribute their behavior to something internal to them, some quality of their personality. But if you were to snap at someone, you'd be aware of all the context. The headache you've been managing all day, the stressful email you received that morning, the pressure you're under from multiple directions. You'd see your behavior as an understandable, if regrettable, response to difficult circumstances. Or perhaps you notice someone's house is messy and you make assumptions about their character. They must be lazy or careless or lacking in self-discipline, while your own messy house is something you explain with reference to circumstances. How busy you've been, the competing demands on your time, the temporary nature of this chaos that you'll address when things settle down. This pattern extends to larger judgments as well. When you see someone struggling financially or making poor health choices or stuck in difficult patterns, there's a tendency to attribute those situations to their personal failings, their lack of willpower or wisdom or effort, while similar struggles in your own life feel obviously connected to circumstances. The job market, the food environment, the stresses you're managing, the resources you lack. Understanding the fundamental attribution error invites something important, a greater generosity in how you interpret others' behavior, a willingness to consider that they, like you, are responding to circumstances you cannot fully see, that their actions might be more situational and less dispositional than they appear from your external vantage point. It also invites awareness that others are likely making the same error about you, attributing to your character what actually arises from your circumstances, judging you more harshly than they judge themselves in similar situations. This awareness can help you hold others' judgments more lightly, knowing they're working with incomplete information. And this reminds us that understanding behavior, whether our own or others, requires humility and curiosity, a recognition that the truth is usually more complex than it appears, more situational than we assume, less reducible to simple character judgments than our minds naturally want to make it. The IKEA Effect. There is a curious way that the act of creating something, even partially, changes how you value it, infusing it with meaning and worth that goes beyond its objective quality or usefulness. The researchers Michael Norton, Daniel Mochon, and Dan Ariely named this phenomenon after the Swedish furniture company whose products require customer assembly, noticing that people tend to value items they've built themselves more highly than identical items that came pre-assembled. The effort invested, the participation in creation, somehow transforms the object in your perception. This isn't simply about the result being objectively better because you customized it to your preferences. Even when the self-made version is clearly inferior in quality to something made by experts, you tend to value it more. The involvement itself creates attachment, pride, a sense of ownership that extends beyond mere possession into something more personal. They demonstrated this in studies where participants were asked to build simple origami figures or assemble IKEA boxes. Afterward, they were willing to pay significantly more for their own creations than for identical items made by others, even though their creations were often awkwardly constructed, imperfect. The labor, the touch of their own hands, the time invested had made these objects more precious to them. For example, you might notice this in how you feel about a meal you've cooked yourself versus one prepared by someone else, even if the restaurant version is more skillfully made, more complex in flavor, objectively superior. There's something special about the meal you made. You take pride in it, enjoy it differently value it partly because it emerged from your own effort. Or perhaps you've experienced this with creative projects, a painting you made, a piece of writing, a garden you planted. These things carry a weight of meaning that similar objects created by others don't quite match, not because yours are necessarily better, but because they're yours in a deeper sense, born from your time, your attention, your hands. This tendency appears in larger contexts as well. Ideas you've contributed to developing feel more valuable than ideas simply presented to you fully formed. Processes you've helped design feel more legitimate and sensible than those imposed from elsewhere, even when the content is quite similar. Understanding the IKEA effect helps explain why participation matters so much in creating buy-in and commitment. When people help build something, a plan, a product, a solution, they develop attachment to it, investment in its success, not just because the result might be better suited to their needs, but because the act of participation itself creates psychological ownership. It also reveals something about the value of effort in creating meaning. Things that come too easily, that require nothing of you, may serve their purpose perfectly well, but lack the particular resonance that comes with investment. The effort isn't wasted even when it doesn't improve the result. It changes your relationship to what you've made. And this reminds us that value isn't purely objective, residing in the qualities of the thing itself. Value is partly created through relationship, through the story of how something came to be, through your participation in bringing it into existence. Understanding this doesn't diminish the value. It simply reveals that value has both objective and subjective dimensions. Cognitive dissonance. Building from this understanding of how we create value through our actions, there is another fundamental pattern worth exploring. One that reveals how the mind seeks harmony between what you believe and what you do, and what happens when those elements fall out of alignment. The psychologist Leon Festinger developed the theory of cognitive dissonance in the 1950s, proposing that when you hold contradictory beliefs, or when your behavior contradicts your beliefs, you experience psychological discomfort, a tension, an unease that motivates you to restore consistency somehow. And the ways you restore that consistency aren't always what you might expect. Sometimes you change your behavior to match your beliefs, which seems straightforward and sensible. But often, especially when the behavior is already done or difficult to change, you instead adjust your beliefs to match your behavior, reshaping what you think in order to maintain the sense that your actions are reasonable and justified. Festinger's famous study involved observing members of a group who believed the world would end on a specific date. They had made significant commitments based on this belief, quit jobs, given away possessions, gathered to await the prophesied event. When the date passed and the world didn't end, they faced enormous dissonance. Their beliefs contradicted the obvious reality. Some members facing this contradiction did change their beliefs, acknowledged they'd been wrong and left the group. But many others, interestingly, became more committed to the belief, not less. They reframed the outcome, deciding that their faith and gathering had convinced God to spare the world. Their behavior had been too costly to simply dismiss, so they adjusted their interpretation of reality to justify what they'd done. For example, imagine you've made a major purchase, something expensive that required considerable sacrifice, and then you begin to notice its flaws, its limitations, ways it doesn't quite live up to what you hoped. You experience dissonance between the decision you made and the reality you're now encountering. And rather than simply accepting that you made a poor choice, you might find yourself emphasizing its positive qualities, downplaying the negatives, convincing yourself it was actually a wise purchase. Your mind works to reduce the dissonance by adjusting your perception to align with your action. Or perhaps you notice this in smaller daily ways. You consider yourself an environmentally conscious person, but you drive when you could walk. Rather than changing your behavior, which would be inconvenient, you might adjust your beliefs slightly, telling yourself that this particular trip really does require the car, that your overall impact is still positive, that individual actions don't matter that much anyway. The dissonance between your self-concept and your behavior gets resolved by reshaping your thinking rather than your actions. This pattern appears constantly, often beneath conscious awareness. You justify decisions you've made by convincing yourself they were better than the alternatives. You defend positions you've taken publicly, even when privately you have doubts. You maintain consistency between your actions and your self-image by selectively remembering, interpreting, and believing things that support that consistency. Understanding cognitive dissonance helps explain why changing your mind can be so difficult, especially about things you've already acted on. Admitting error creates dissonance between your past actions and current understanding, and it's often easier to maintain your existing beliefs than to face that discomfort. It also reveals why taking action, even small action, can shift your beliefs. When you act as though you believe something, even tentatively, you create subtle pressure to actually believe it, to bring your internal state into alignment with your external behavior. This is why public commitments are more powerful than private intentions. The behavior of committing publicly creates dissonance if you don't follow through, motivating consistency. And this reminds us that beliefs and actions influence each other in both directions, not just beliefs shaping actions, but actions shaping beliefs. We are constantly working to maintain internal coherence, and that work involves subtle adjustments to both what we think and what we do. Understanding this process helps us hold our own certainties a bit more lightly, recognizing that what we believe might be partly constructed to justify what we've already done, rather than purely reflecting some objective truth we've discovered. The self-serving bias. There is a gentle asymmetry in how you explain the things that happen to you, a pattern that reveals how the mind protects itself, maintains its sense of competence and worth, even in the face of setbacks and failures. When something goes well, when you succeed at a task, achieve a goal, receive recognition, you tend quite naturally to attribute that success to your own qualities, your skill, your effort, your intelligence, your good judgment. You see success as something you earned, something that reflects who you are and what you're capable of. But when something goes poorly, when you fail, make a mistake, fall short of expectations, the pattern shifts. Now you're more likely to point to external factors, bad luck, unfair circumstances, other people's interference, the difficulty of the task. The failure becomes situational rather than personal, something that happened to you rather than something that came from you. The psychologists Dale Miller and Michael Ross, among many others, have documented this self-serving bias extensively, observing how it operates across cultures and contexts, protecting self-esteem while simultaneously distorting your understanding of cause and effect. This tendency isn't usually conscious or deliberate. You're not sitting down and deciding to take credit for successes while deflecting blame for failures. It happens more subtly in the stories you tell yourself and others about why things unfolded as they did. The mind naturally seeks explanations that allow you to feel competent and worthwhile, and it finds those explanations more readily when outcomes are positive. Example, imagine you receive a positive performance review at work. You're likely to feel that the praise reflects your genuine capabilities, that you earned it through your hard work and skill. The good outcome confirms what you hope is true about yourself, and you accept that confirmation readily. But if the review is critical, pointing out areas where you've fallen short, you might find yourself thinking about all the external factors, the unrealistic expectations, the lack of support, the circumstances that made success difficult. The mind works to preserve your sense of competence by locating the problem outside yourself. Or perhaps you notice this in relationships. When an interaction goes well, when someone responds positively to you, you might attribute it to your charm, your thoughtfulness, your good communication. But when someone responds negatively or pulls away, you're more likely to think about their bad mood, their personal issues, their inability to appreciate you properly. The asymmetry protects your self-concept from the erosion that would come from taking full responsibility for every negative outcome. This bias appears in group contexts as well. Teams tend to credit their successes to their collective abilities and efforts, while attributing failures to external obstacles, maintaining group cohesion and morale through selective explanation of outcomes. Understanding the self-serving bias invites a more balanced view of success and failure. It suggests that when things go well, you might want to also notice the luck, the help, the favorable circumstances that contributed, not to diminish your role, but to see the fuller picture. And when things go poorly, you might want to consider not just the external factors, but also where you might genuinely have more to learn, where your own choices and actions played a role. This doesn't mean abandoning the protective function this bias serves. Self-esteem matters, and being overly harsh with yourself serves no one, but awareness creates the possibility of a more accurate understanding, seeing both your genuine contributions to success and your genuine role in failures, holding both with appropriate responsibility and appropriate compassion. And this reminds us that the stories we tell about our lives are always, to some degree, shaped by our needs. Our need to feel competent, worthy, good. Understanding this doesn't make the stories false, but it does reveal them as interpreted as one possible version among many. And it invites curiosity about what other versions might exist, what we might be missing in our preferred narratives. The contrast effect. Connected to this exploration of how we make sense of experience is another fundamental pattern, one that reveals how your perception of anything is shaped profoundly by what you encountered just before it. You might imagine that you perceive things based on their absolute qualities, that something is heavy or light, expensive or cheap, attractive or unattractive based on some objective scale. But research reveals that your judgments are deeply relative, shaped by context and sequence, by what serves as the comparison point for whatever you're currently evaluating. The psychologist Solomon Asch explored this phenomenon, demonstrating that identical stimuli can be perceived quite differently depending on what precedes them. A lukewarm temperature feels warm after exposure to cold, but cool after exposure to heat. A medium-weight object feels heavy after lifting something light, but light after lifting something heavy. Your perception calibrates itself based on recent experience, using that experience as an anchor for judgment. This contrast effect operates across all domains of perception and evaluation, shaping not just sensory judgments, but also your assessments of attractiveness, value, quality, fairness, and appropriateness. For example, imagine you're looking at apartments, searching for a place to live. If the first apartment you see is small, dark, poorly maintained, and you then see a moderately sized, reasonably bright apartment in acceptable condition, that second apartment might seem quite appealing, spacious and pleasant by contrast. But if you'd seen that same apartment first, or if it came after viewing several beautiful, well-maintained spaces, it would appear quite different in your perception. Less appealing, perhaps even disappointing. The apartment itself hasn't changed, but your perception of it shifts dramatically based on what came before. Or perhaps you notice this in pricing. A $100 item seems expensive when you've been browsing items in the $20 to $30 range, but seems quite reasonable, even cheap, when you've just been looking at items costing several $100s. The contrast reframes your sense of what's normal, what's acceptable, what represents good value. This effect appears in social perception as well. Meeting someone moderately attractive after encountering several very attractive people makes them seem less appealing than if you'd met them in isolation. Not because their actual appearance has changed, but because the contrast has shifted your frame of reference. Marketers and salespeople understand this principle well. They might show you expensive options first, knowing that moderately priced options will seem more reasonable by contrast. Or they might show you a clearly inferior option before presenting the one they actually want you to choose, making that choice appear more attractive through comparison. Understanding the contrast effect invites awareness of how your judgments are shaped by sequence and context. When you're evaluating something, an opportunity, a purchase, a person, a choice, it's worth asking yourself what you're comparing it to and whether that comparison point is truly relevant or whether it's simply whatever happened to come before. It also suggests being thoughtful about the order in which you encounter things when making important decisions. The sequence can shape your perceptions in ways that might not serve your actual needs and values. What seems wonderful by contrast to something poor might actually be merely adequate, while something genuinely good might seem disappointing when it follows something exceptional. And this reminds us again that perception is not a simple recording of objective reality. It's a constructed experience, shaped by context, by what came before and what might come after, by the comparisons your mind naturally makes as it tries to understand and categorize the constant stream of information flowing through your awareness. Knowing this doesn't give you perfect objectivity, but it does create a small space for questioning your initial reactions, for looking beyond the contrast to the thing itself. The endowment effect. There is something that happens to an object the moment it becomes yours, a subtle shift in how you perceive its value, its worth, its place in the world, simply through the fact of ownership, even when nothing about the object itself has changed. The behavioral economist Richard Thaler gave a name to this phenomenon, the endowment effect. Observing that people consistently demand more money to give up something they own than they would be willing to pay to acquire that same thing if they didn't already have it. This asymmetry appears almost immediately upon taking ownership. The object becomes more valuable in your eyes, not because of any objective change in its qualities, but simply because it's now yours. It has crossed some invisible threshold from the external world into the realm of your possessions, and in crossing that threshold, it gains a kind of psychological weight it didn't have before. Researchers have demonstrated this in elegant experiments. One classic study involved giving half the participants in a group coffee mugs, while the other half received nothing. Then they created a market where mug owners could sell their mugs to non-owners. The price at which owners were willing to sell what they felt the mug was worth now that they owned it was roughly twice as high as what non-owners were willing to pay to acquire the same mug. Ownership itself had created a premium that existed only in perception. This isn't about the mug becoming more useful once owned, or about sellers trying to make a profit. The effect appeared even when participants had owned the mug for only minutes, when they'd received it by pure chance rather than through any effort. Simply having it in their possession, considering it theirs, shifted how they valued it. For example, you might notice this when you're deciding whether to keep or discard something you own. A book you haven't opened in years, a piece of clothing you no longer wear, an item gathering dust in storage. When you consider giving it away or selling it, you might feel a hesitation, a sense that it's worth more than someone else would likely pay, that parting with it feels like a loss, even though you haven't been using it. The ownership has created attachment that goes beyond the object's practical value. Or perhaps you experience this when negotiating the sale of something you own, a car perhaps, or a house. The price you feel is fair, that matches your sense of the item's value, often exceeds what buyers are offering, not because you're being unreasonable, but because ownership has genuinely shifted your perception. You see the value more clearly, feel it more deeply, partly because it's yours and you're contemplating the loss of it. This tendency connects deeply to loss aversion. The pain of losing something feels more intense than the pleasure of gaining something equivalent, and once you own something, giving it up becomes a loss rather than a foregone gain. The psychological ledger shifts, and with it, your sense of appropriate value. Understanding the endowment effect helps explain why we accumulate possessions over time, why it's easier to acquire things than to release them. Each item, once owned, gains this additional psychological weight that makes parting with it feel more costly than keeping it, even when keeping it serves no practical purpose. It also appears in larger contexts. You might overvalue your own ideas, your own work, your own perspective, simply because they're yours. You've invested in them, they've crossed that threshold into ownership, and that ownership creates a perception of value that others, viewing from outside, might not share. This awareness invites a gentle questioning of your valuations. When you feel strongly that something you own is worth a certain amount, or that parting with it would be a significant loss, you might pause and ask, am I seeing this clearly, or is ownership itself adding value that exists mainly in my perception? Would I feel the same way about an identical item if it belonged to someone else? And this reminds us that value is never purely objective, never simply inherent in things themselves. It's created through relationship, through the stories we tell, through the simple fact of possession. Understanding this doesn't eliminate the feeling. The endowment effect will continue to operate. But it does create awareness that allows you to hold your possessions, your ideas, your positions a bit more lightly when circumstances suggest that releasing them might serve you well.